There was once a doctor and a nurse who were working out of hours. They were working through the night, and they responded to the anguish pleas of a husband who asks them to come and to visit his wife who lay desperately ill in their home. And so this doctor and the nurse, they arrive, they knock at the door, and the husband opens the door, and there's the doctor with his kind of black doctor's bag thing that they carry, and I don't know why there was a nurse there, but there was a nurse there too with him, and so the husband sort of ushers them in, and he says, go upstairs, see Jane, and this man, he's so wound up himself, he stays downstairs in the kitchen, and he's just kind of pacing up and down in the kitchen whilst the doctor and the nurse are upstairs seeing to his wife. And after a few minutes, the doctor comes down, and there's a worried look on his face. And he says to the man, he says, have you got a screwdriver? And the man thinks, oh my goodness, what is going on? Why do you need a screwdriver? He goes off and he finds his screw, because he's always got a good screwdriver sort of in the drawer. Pulls that out and he gives that to the doctor, and he goes back upstairs. And a few minutes later, he's still sort of pacing around the kitchen, and the nurse comes down. And there's a really concerned look over her face as well. And she says, have you got a tin opener? Have you got a tin opener? And the man's thinking, like, what is going on? So he finds a tin opener. He gives the tin opener to the nurse. And, he's pacing up and down. A few minutes later, the doctor comes down again. And you can see that there's kind of beads of sweat starting to form on the doctor's, brow. He's really concerned. And he says, I've just got one last question. He said, have you got a hammer and a chisel? And the guy just bursts out and he says, I can't take any more. What is going on? Can you tell me? Is Jane okay? And the doctor says, I don't know yet. I can't get my bag open. Not much of a punchline, I know. Now, for some of us, we feel a bit like that when we come to the Bible, don't we? It feels hard just to struggle to get in the bag, let alone to understand what's going on, or indeed what's wrong. And sometimes for us, there can be a real tension as we read the Bible, because what we can find in Scripture are tons of examples of people who find life and find freedom, who find healing, who find God's presence and encounter God in amazing ways. And sometimes for us, it can feel like there's a gap. There's a gap. And the gap is between what our lived experience is, what our felt experience is, and what we can read in the Scriptures. And sometimes that can be a real struggle for each one of us. There is that tension. We want that freedom and that life that we see Jesus giving so freely. And we recognize some of that in our lives, but we also recognize that we want more of it. We want more of that freedom, more of his presence, more of his power displayed in our lives and in the lives of those around us. And so there can be that kind of tension. We know we're there, but we just can't quite open the bag. We can't quite open it up to see what God is doing. And, for many people, particularly those writers of the New Testament, they would have looked at this thing that we often call the Old Testament. And they wouldn't really have described it as old in the way that we can sometimes think of it. When they would think about the Scriptures as they had them, they wouldn't have thought of them as antiquated or as out of date, but rather as a living resource for understanding God, understanding God's ways in the world, understanding how God's ways are with each one of us. And nowhere, I think, is that more true than as we look at the book that we're opening up this morning, Exodus. And I'm delighted this morning to be starting this new series, looking at the book of Exodus together in the coming weeks. And you'll appreciate with me that excellent graphic that we've got there. It's even got the woody swirls. Look, it's very, very impressive. And so, as we think about this, very, in many ways, that there is that sense of drama, that sense of theatre in the book of Exodus. It's a fantastic story. It's an exciting plot. It has a dramatic escape of thousands of people from an abusive despot from tyranny at the hands of the Pharaoh of Egypt. There's it's a bit like a film, isn't it? There's lots of special effects in this. You've got the parting of the Red Sea and all sorts of wonderful miracles that we see, miracles galore. And of course, there's some great actors involved in this story as well. Particularly the person of Moses, who is a bit of an unlikely hero, a bit of an unlikely leader, negotiating the release of God's people. It's a gripping story. But it's a story made all the more gripping because of the underlying theme that the story addresses, leaving an unacceptable situation in search of a better one. And this is one to which we can all relate. If you've ever felt like you know exactly where you're going in life, only to take one turn and to find yourself reduced to what feels like aimless wandering, then there's something in Exodus for you. For the Jews, it's a story that defines their very existence. It's a story of how God rescued them and made them a people, his people. And we return ourselves to Exodus time and time again because we see in it some powerful stories that enable us to think about our time and our place. For the African-American slaves, many of whom were Christians, they understood and used the language of the Exodus to help them to both look for and long for their own freedom from captivity, freedom from slavery, from bondage. And so they longed for that day when they would, in the language of Exodus, be free at last. It's an epic story, not a kind of Disney-style story. It's not of the Disney variety. It's a harsh and it's a truthful story. It's full of frustrations and the realities of fighting for that freedom in the midst of difficulties, both outside and also divisions within God's people. But as we go on a bit of a journey together, as we look at the book of Exodus in these coming weeks, we'll find that it's a story that has many keys to our own freedom. And that the ultimate Exodus, the ultimate freedom that we see Exodus point to, freedom in Jesus, can be attained. Now, the story of Genesis, of which is just the book of the Bible just before Exodus, is one that ends on a bit of a cliffhanger. And it's really interesting that as you see that promise to the person of Abraham, the father of the Jewish nation, that God would bless him and he would bless his descendants, and that they would be numerous, more numerous than the stars in the sky, more numerous than the sand on the seashore. We see through the chapters of Genesis how God comes and begins to bring that to pass. And yet by the end of Genesis, if you know the story of Joseph, either seen it in a play or read it in the book, you'll know that the end of Genesis is one where God's people, who are called to be carriers of his presence in the place in which God has put them, find themselves somewhere else. They find themselves in Egypt. And at the start of Exodus, we find that that's a bit of a problem. Because 400 years have passed from the time of Joseph. There's a new Pharaoh, a new guy in town, and he is no fan of the Israelites. And just to show us that this is very much part of that ongoing story from Genesis, it's interesting. If we're reading this book in its original language, in Hebrew, the first word of Exodus is and. It's and. And so some of your Bibles might have it as so. It's the same kind of thing. There's a sense in which, this is a continuing story. What is going to happen next? How is God going to set his people free from the situation in which they find themselves? And so Joseph and his compatriots, they're long gone. And so we read these verses in the book of Exodus. Now, if you've got a Bible, you might like to follow along with me, either electronically or in hard copy, but it's also on the screens behind us. So I'm reading from Exodus chapter 1 and verses 6 through to verse 10. It says this: "Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them." That's the land of Egypt. "And then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. 'Look,' he said to his people, 'the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal with them shrewdly, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies and fight against us and leave the country.'" Now, it's interesting there. You'll see that the way in which Exodus talks about God's people is that it says that they become exceedingly numerous. And this is another one of those callbacks to Genesis. If you've read the first few chapters of Genesis, you might remember these verses in chapter 1, where it says that God blessed them, that's Adam and Eve, and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it." If you remember the story of Noah, the wonderful story of how God saves his people through the ark and saves Noah, an upright man, and through him starts again with the world. God says this to Noah. It says, God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth." Here again in Exodus, we read that very thing. God's people are blessed. God's people are increasing in number. They are multiplying. They are, in the words of Exodus, exceedingly fruitful. They're teeming. They are numerous. This is creation language that Exodus is using here. And so these Israelites are increasing in numbers in Egypt as a sign of God's presence with them, as a sign of God's blessing over their lives. And like their forefathers before them, they are experiencing his blessing. But what we also read is that this fruitfulness of God's people doesn't best please Pharaoh. He's not too chuffed about that situation. And as such, Pharaoh is opposed to the very thing that God is blessing. Yeah? Pharaoh is opposed to the increasing numbers of God's people, and he tries to put a stop to that. And what we see here is the beginning of an increasing cycle of where Pharaoh, this Egyptian king, is increasingly against the plans of God for his people. So Pharaoh here hatches a plan. And he begins by saying, you know what we're going to do is we are going to enslave God's people. We're going to make them our slaves. We're going to put them in forced labor. We're going to put rulers over them who would work them, as it says in verse 14 of chapter 1, work them ruthlessly. But the more God's people are oppressed by Pharaoh, the more they seem to grow, the more they multiply. Pharaoh's plan doesn't work. And so Pharaoh moves to stage 2 of his plan. And stage 2 of his plan is to take all of the midwives and say to them, when a new Israelite baby is born, if it's a boy, kill it. See, there is a horrific genocide at work amongst and towards God's people. And unsurprisingly, that plan doesn't work. These midwives you see is perhaps the kind of first example of civil disobedience. They accidentally don't manage to arrive on time. And in fact, even the opposite of that seems to happen. The midwives themselves become fruitful and begin to give birth to children themselves. And so Pharaoh goes to plan C. And plan C is genocide on a huge scale. He orders every infant boy, every Israelite infant boy, to be thrown into the river Nile. The murder of all Israelite infants. It's interesting. The River Nile was the very thing that gave life and brought abundance to the place of Egypt. And yet Pharaoh turns round and turns that thing, that life-giving force, into an instrument of death for the people of Israel. Note that it's water. Really interesting. Water keeps coming up through Exodus. And so the significance of this act can't be underplayed. And so what we then find, of course, is one mother who you can imagine the turmoil that she must have gone through. This mother does do what she has been asked to do. She throws her son into the water. But rather than throw her son into the Nile River to drown, she has created if you like, a basket, a reed basket for that baby, in the hope and the prayer that that baby will be kept safe by God. And of course, what we read is that that's exactly what happens for just that one baby, at least, very sadly for many of the others. But this one baby is found and he's adopted by Pharaoh's daughter and kept safe. It's interesting that this baby is kept safe in a basket. There's only one other place where that word for basket is used in the whole of the Bible. It's the ark. Yeah. So God kept his people safe through the waters by providing an ark for Noah and for his family to keep them safe, keep them inside God's promises. And here what we see is God again keeping his people safe, hatching a plan using a mini ark, if you like, to keep Moses safe and thereby to provide a way out for his people. What's God doing? He has got a plan. He is at work. And what we see is Moses here in this mini ark going through the waters. We see him then doing first what all of God's people will do as we read through Exodus. Because there will come a time in Exodus where the people have to do what they've seen their leader go through. And Moses is the first one to lead God's people through the waters of the Red Sea, that parting of the Red Sea that we'll read about in a few weeks. And so God's people follow their leader through the Red Sea based on God's plan to keep them safe. Let's not even mention Jesus at this point, but if we did, it would be really interesting to follow through Matthew's gospel particularly and see there how Jesus does exactly the same. He, in the first 4 chapters of Matthew, escapes a despotic ruler who is trying to commit mass genocide against all young boys and escapes to Egypt. When he finds himself then coming back to God's promised land, what's the first thing he does? He gets in a river, he gets in water, and he's baptized by God as a sign that he will be the first one amongst us to say, ask for that repentance and that forgiveness of sins. He's showing us the way that we would all do the same. We would all pass through those waters and find freedom in what Jesus has done for us. And so we've met this guy, Moses. But the next time we see him, it's much later on in chapter 2. And if you've got your Bibles, you might want to read this with me. Because by now, Moses is no longer a young baby, but he is a man. He's grown up in Pharaoh's court at the care of this Pharaoh's daughter. And then we read in chapter 2 and verse 11 this. It says, one day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were, and he watched them at their hard labor. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. And looking this way and that and seeing that no one was there, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And the next day he went out and saw 2 Hebrews fighting, and he asked one what was wrong. And they said, why? Are you going to, you hitting your fellow Hebrew? Why are you doing that? And the man said, Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed that Egyptian?" And then Moses was afraid and thought, what I did must have become known by others. I must have been seen. And when Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian. And what we see here is God's got a plan. But Moses thinks he's got a plan too. And when he sees this Egyptian ill-treating one of his own people, Moses responds. And he responds in his own strength. He, in anger, in fear, in frustration, we don't know, we're not told, but he responds in his own strength. And at the mistreatment of one of his fellow Hebrews, he kills this Egyptian man and tries to cover up his tracks. And what we see here is then the result of that action for Moses is that he himself has to leg it, get out of trouble, get away from Pharaoh, who would surely take his life if he were found by him. Moses here learns that he needs to rely on God's timing. He needs to rely on God's strength. He needs to know what it is God would have him do and not do things on his own. Moses messes up, in other words. But actually what he does in messing up is not get in the way of God's plans, but somehow God weaves in through the failures of Moses, as well as his successes, God's own plans. You know, God's plans and his purposes in our lives, in the world around us, will happen whether we want them to or not, and they'll happen with us or without us. But it's a lot more fun when we cooperate with God and we're part of his plans and purposes for this world. You know, the title of the talk this morning is Plans. And I don't know about you, but if you think about this, you know, when the Bible quotes the Bible, it has a favourite verse that it likes to quote. I don't know if you've got a favourite verse. I bet, you know, if we kind of I won't take a straw poll, but, you know, I bet one of the big ones would be Jeremiah 29:11, if you know that one, which says, you know, "For I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord, plans to prosper you." That it's a wonderful verse about God's plans in our life. But interestingly, that isn't the most quoted verse by other authors of the Bible. When the Bible's looking to quote itself, the verses that it uses are from Exodus. Exodus 34. This is the most commonly recurring verse 6. The Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. You will see that verse dotted throughout the Bible hundreds of times. And actually what we see here is the book of Exodus with Moses starts as it means to go on. What we see is both true for Moses and is true for us. There's a catalogue of failures. There's a catalogue of failures for Moses. You know, if you go on your holidays to Egypt, where do people go? Sharm el-Sheikh and stuff like that, don't they? Has anyone been to Egypt on holiday? I've not. It sounds wonderful. If you go on your holidays to Egypt and you fancy taking a little detour, a little kind of break in your holidays, and you fancy going to the promised land, and so you hire yourself a camel and you take a trip from Egypt to the promised land, you can probably get there in about 2 weeks, apparently. Not done it myself. It probably takes you a bit longer these days, roads and everything. If you want to do that, you can. It took God's people, as they escaped Egypt, and as we read through Exodus, 40 years, not 2 weeks. And it does raise the obvious question, how on earth did that happen? Why did they take so long to go to the promised land. And the way we often put it is like this. God brought his people out of Egypt, but it needed 40 years to get Egypt out of God's people. God brought his people out of Egypt, but it took 40 years to get Egypt out of God's people. In other words, they continued in a slavery mindset. They continued to think like slaves. And here what we see in our favourite verse in the entire Bible, the most commonly quoted one is this. We may fail, we may trip up, we may make mistakes, but the Lord, what's true about him? He's compassionate, he's gracious, he's slow to anger, he's abounding in love and faithfulness. And what we see through the book of Exodus time and time and time again is that even though we, in our weaknesses, make mistakes, even though we try to do things in our own strength and fail, inevitably fail, God is gracious and compassionate. He sticks with us. And those things do not get in the way of God's plans and purposes. God's people needed to learn these three things, and I think the same is true for us. We see here Moses tripping up and making a mistake, taking life into his own hands and killing that Egyptian. And in that error, he finds himself fleeing, and only many years later does he find out what God's plans and purposes again need to learn these three things. Do they believe in God's power? God's power is amazingly at work in the book of Exodus. We see God parting the Red Sea and the people walking on dry land. Do we trust God's power in our lives? Do you trust God's provision? God's people, time and time again in Exodus, find themselves needing to trust that God is their provider. Whether it's quail from heaven, whether it's that magical manna coming down from heaven to feed them, give them their daily bread each day. They need to learn to trust God's provision. And of course, they also need to learn to pursue God's presence. It's God, as we read through Exodus, that's the one that's the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. These people, God's people, need to learn to follow him. Stick closely to God. Stick closely to where he is. And that's not a bad template for our lives either. It's a challenge for each one of us. Do I believe in God's power? Or do I find myself looking for another way of doing things? Am I going to choose to believe that God is able? As I look at the gap in my own life between some of the amazing things that I read in the Bible of God, people finding freedom and life and healing and wholeness, will I choose to trust that God is doing that work in me too? That God is the provider. He is the one that brings freedom and life, his presence to me. And, for me, as for all of us, will we trust that actually it's his presence that leads us forward? That as we begin to experience more of his fullness, would we choose to keep close to him? And so when we look at Exodus together over the coming weeks, I think these three questions will come back time and time again. Do we believe his power? Do we trust his provision? Do we pursue his presence? Do we understand his power to liberate us? His provision for each one of us? His presence that changes us? So God's people here have some important lessons to learn as they find their freedom. And note that it's not a linear thing. They don't start in one place and then they click their fingers and find themselves happily in God's promised land for them, their freedom, their wholeness. It's wonderful to see examples of where God just comes in his power and just in moments, people's lives are changed and transformed. But if the story of Exodus tells us anything, it's that actually there's another pattern, there's another template. And whilst we want to love and look for and celebrate when God breaks through in that kind of power, what we also see is that actually it's a process, it's a journey. And God's people in Exodus are on a journey of learning what it means to find freedom. And they're also on a journey of learning what it looks like to mess up and then to choose to turn around and turn back to that God who's gracious, who's compassionate, who's abounding in love and faithfulness. And once again, to put their trust in that God.